Amara walked into the airport, pulling her sleek carry-on suitcase behind her. It was a busy afternoon, and the terminal was filled with people rushing to their gates, chatting on phones, or grabbing last-minute snacks before their flights. She had traveled countless times for work, but today felt different. Today, she was flying first class, a well-deserved treat after months of exhausting meetings, late nights, and endless deadlines. She reached the check-in counter, handing over her passport and ticket with a polite smile. The airline agent glanced at her, then at the ticket, and back at her again. There was a slight pause, a hesitation that Amara noticed immediately. The agent's eyes flickered with something unspoken, as if she were second-guessing what she saw. But after a beat, she forced a smile and handed back the boarding pass. "Enjoy your flight," the agent said. "Thank you," Amara replied, keeping her expression neutral. She was used to this. A moment of doubt, a silent question, as if people couldn't believe she belonged in certain spaces. She had experienced it in boardrooms, luxury stores, and now, apparently, at the airport. But she refused to let it bother her. Walking confidently toward security, she placed her bag on the conveyor belt, removed her shoes, and stepped through the scanner. Once cleared, she collected her things and made her way to the first-class lounge. The space was quiet and elegant, filled with plush seats and travelers sipping coffee or working on laptops. A uniformed attendant greeted her, but again, there was that small pause, that flicker of surprise in her eyes before she gestured toward the seating area. Amara chose a comfortable chair near the window, enjoying a warm cup of tea as she watched planes take off in the distance. This was supposed to be a relaxing trip, and she was determined to enjoy it. When boarding was announced, she gathered her things and headed to the gate. As she approached the priority boarding line, she noticed a couple of passengers glancing at her, as if double-checking whether she was in the right place. The gate agent barely looked at the other first-class passengers as they handed over their tickets, but when Amara stepped forward, she got the same questioning look she had received earlier. "First class?" the agent asked, tilting her head slightly. "Yes," Amara said, handing over her boarding pass. The agent scanned it, and for a brief second, it seemed like she was expecting an error to appear. But the screen flashed green, confirming Amara's seat. The agent quickly masked her reaction with a smile. "Enjoy your flight," she said, handing the ticket back. Amara took her boarding pass and walked toward the jet bridge, her head held high. She had worked too hard to let small moments like these get under her skin. She belonged here, and she wasn't about to let anyone make her feel otherwise. But as she stepped onto the plane and reached her seat, she had a feeling the journey was about to get even more interesting. Amara walked down the aisle of the plane, feeling the soft carpet beneath her shoes. She glanced at her boarding pass once more. Seat 2A, right by the window. First class had always seemed like a dream when she was younger, but today it was her reality. She worked hard, she earned her success, and she deserved this moment of comfort. As she approached her seat, she noticed the luxurious leather seats, the extra legroom, and the quiet atmosphere of the first-class cabin. It was a stark contrast to the crowded economy section she had flown in many times before. She placed her carry-on in the overhead compartment and slid into her seat, sighing in relief. This was going to be a smooth flight, at least that's what she thought. Just as she was adjusting the seatbelt, a flight attendant with neatly tied hair and a polished uniform walked over. She had a pleasant smile, but something in her eyes seemed hesitant. "Excuse me, ma'am," the flight attendant said, glancing down at Amara's seat number. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Amara looked up, surprised. She had already shown her ticket at the gate. Why was she being questioned again? Keeping her composure, she reached into her purse, pulled out her boarding pass, and handed it over with a polite but firm smile. "This is my seat," she said. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment before taking the ticket and checking the details. Her eyes scanned the information, and then she forced a small laugh. "Oh, I see. she said, just making sure. Thank you. She handed the ticket back, but Amara didn't miss the way she quickly glanced at another flight attendant nearby, exchanging a brief, knowing look. Amara had seen that look before, the kind people gave when they assumed something wasn't right, when they doubted her place somewhere. Trying not to let it bother her, she turned toward the window and took a deep breath. She wasn't going to let small doubts ruin her experience. A few minutes later, another flight attendant passed by, this time a young man with neatly combed hair. As he walked past, he slowed down slightly, eyes flicking toward the seat number above Amara's head. Then, as if trying to be subtle, he glanced down at her ticket, which she had left on the armrest. Amara sighed. It was clear now. Some of the crew didn't believe she was supposed to be here. Maybe they thought she had accidentally booked the wrong class. Maybe they assumed something else. But whatever it wasn't her problem. She straightened in her seat, deciding to ignore the subtle doubts. If they had a real issue, they could come and ask her directly. Until then, she was going to enjoy this flight. As more passengers boarded, Amara noticed a few of them sneaking glances in her direction. Some were curious, some indifferent, and some, like the flight attendants, seemed to be wondering the same thing. Did she really belong in first class? Amara smiled to herself. They would find out soon enough. The plane was now almost full, and the flight attendants were busy helping passengers settle in. Amara adjusted her seat and took a deep breath, trying to relax. She had been looking forward to this trip, and she wasn't going to let a few strange looks ruin her experience. A soft chime echoed through the cabin, followed by the captain's voice welcoming everyone aboard and announcing the estimated flight time. Amara reached for the small menu tucked beside her seat, eager to see what first-class service had to offer. As she scanned the options, she felt a presence nearby. She looked up to see two flight attendants standing a few rows ahead, whispering to each other. Every few seconds, one of them would glance in her direction before quickly looking away. Amara sighed, placing the menu back down. This wasn't her imagination. She knew when people were talking about her. A moment later, one of the attendants, a woman with a neatly tied bun, walked toward her again. She stopped beside Amara's seat, her expression polite but careful. "Ma'am," she said, keeping her voice low, "I just wanted to check if everything is okay." Amara frowned slightly. "Yes, everything is fine," she replied. The flight attendant hesitated, as if expecting a different answer. "All right," she said after a brief pause. "If you need anything, let us know." Amara nodded, but as the woman turned away, she caught another glance exchanged between the attendants. Something wasn't right. They weren't checking on any of the other passengers like this. Just then, a businessman in a gray suit walked down the aisle. He glanced at Amara, then at the seat number above her, then back at her again. He didn't say anything, but his expression was clear. He was surprised to see her sitting there. Amara had seen this reaction before. She had felt it in certain high-end restaurants, at luxury stores, and even in business meetings where she was the only one like her in the room. It was that unspoken question in people's eyes. Do you really belong here? She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she had nothing to prove. She had worked hard for everything she had, and no amount of doubt from strangers was going to change that. As she reached for her bag to grab her book, another flight attendant walked by, this time a man with a professional but distant expression. He slowed down as he passed, pretending to adjust something on the overhead bin. But Amara noticed his eyes flicker toward her boarding pass, which was still on the armrest. She smiled to herself. It was almost amusing now. They were trying to be discreet, but she saw everything. Leaning back in her seat, she decided to ignore them. She was here to enjoy her flight, and that's exactly what she was going to do. But deep inside, she had a feeling that this wasn't the last time. She would have to remind people that she belonged exactly where she was. The plane was now preparing for takeoff. The flight attendants were moving around, making last-minute checks, ensuring that all passengers had their seatbelts fastened and their trays in the upright position. Amara stared out of the window, watching as the airport workers moved around on the ground below. She had always loved the moment just before a flight lifted off, the quiet excitement, the feeling of heading somewhere new. But just as she was beginning to relax, she noticed a shadow fall over her. She turned her head and saw the same flight attendant who had questioned her earlier now standing beside her seat once again. This time, the woman's expression was different, polite, but firm. "Ma'am," she said in a careful tone, "I just want to double-check something. Are you sure this is your seat?" Amara blinked. Was this really happening again? She had already shown her boarding pass before. And yet, here they were, questioning her again. Keeping her voice calm, she picked up her ticket from the armrest and handed it to the attendant. "Yes," she said simply, looking the woman straight in the eye. The flight attendant took the ticket and examined it closely, as if expecting to find a mistake. She glanced at the seat number, then at Amara, then back at the ticket. A small crease formed between her brows, as though she was struggling to accept the information in front of her. After a few long seconds, she gave a short nod and handed the ticket back. "All right," she said, forcing a smile. "Just making sure." Amara took the ticket and placed it back on the armrest. She didn't say anything, but her silence spoke volumes. By now, a few nearby passengers had noticed the interaction. Some of them were pretending not to look, but Amara could tell they were listening. A man sitting across the aisle frowned slightly, as if realizing that something wasn't right. A woman a few rows ahead turned her head slightly, glancing at Amara with quiet curiosity. Amara wasn't surprised. She had experienced moments like this before, times when she was made to feel like she had to prove herself, to justify her presence. It was frustrating, but she had learned how to handle it. She wasn't going to cause a scene, but she also wasn't going to shrink herself to make others comfortable. Instead of arguing, she reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and scrolled through her emails. Within seconds, she found her flight confirmation, along with proof of her Platinum airline membership. She held the phone up so the flight attendant could see it clearly. "Would you like to check again?" she asked, her voice cool but steady. The flight attendant's face turned slightly red. She took a step back, glancing around as if looking for support, but no one spoke. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken words. Finally, the flight attendant gave a short nod. "That won't be necessary," she mumbled before quickly walking away. Amara let out a slow breath. She hadn't raised her voice, but she had made her point. She wasn't here to prove anything. She had already earned her place. The plane was now in the air, cruising smoothly above the clouds. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, and most passengers had settled into their seats. Some were reading, some were watching movies, and others had already dozed off. Amara, however, was still thinking about what had just happened. She wasn't angry, but she was tired of having to prove herself in places where she rightfully belonged. She had booked this seat, paid for it with her hard-earned money, and yet she had been questioned not once, not twice, but multiple times. Just as she was about to shake it off and enjoy the flight, something unexpected happened. A well-dressed man sitting a few rows ahead stood up and walked toward her. He was in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a confident stride. The moment he reached her row, the flight attendants suddenly straightened up, their expressions shifting from uncertainty to immediate recognition. "Ms. Amara, isn't it?" the man said, offering a polite smile. Amara looked at him, surprised. "Yes, that's me." The man extended his hand. "I'm Richard Owens, senior executive at this airline." She shook his hand, still unsure of what was happening. She had not expected an airline executive to be on this flight, let alone to approach her personally. "I couldn't help but notice the way you were treated earlier," he continued, his voice low but firm. "I wanted to personally apologize on behalf of the airline." At that moment, Amara saw the flight attendant stiffen slightly. It was clear they hadn't realized who she was, someone who not only traveled often, but also had connections in high places. "I appreciate that. Amara said calmly. I wasn't looking for special treatment, just fair treatment. Richard nodded. And you should always receive that. We take incidents like this seriously. He glanced at the flight attendants, who were now standing quietly, their previous confidence gone. I'll be addressing this with the crew. Amara simply nodded, letting his words sink in. She didn't need a dramatic scene, but it felt good to know that someone was holding them accountable. After a brief conversation, Richard returned to his seat, and the atmosphere in first class shifted. The flight attendants, who had once doubted her, were now overly polite. One came by with an extra warm towel, another offered her a drink, and yet another made sure she had everything she needed. Amara accepted their service with grace, but she didn't let their sudden kindness erase what had happened. Respect shouldn't be given only after realizing someone has influence. It should be given to everyone, at all times. As she took a sip of her drink and looked out at the clouds, she knew one thing for sure. She had made her point without raising her voice. And that, in itself, was the best response. The flight continued smoothly, and Amara finally allowed herself to relax. She leaned back in her comfortable seat, feeling the soft leather against her skin. The tension from earlier was still there, but it was slowly fading. She had handled the situation with grace, and now she just wanted to enjoy the rest of the journey. The flight attendants were noticeably different now. Instead of questioning her presence, they were overly attentive, stopping by frequently to check if she needed anything. One brought her a fresh glass of juice, another offered her a selection of premium chocolates, and a third politely asked if she would like an extra pillow for more comfort. Amara accepted their gestures with a polite smile, but deep inside, she knew the truth. They weren't doing this because they suddenly respected her. They were doing it because they had been called out. She had seen this pattern before. People who doubted her would change their behavior the moment they realized she had power, status, or connections. But what about the next person? The one who didn't have an airline executive stepping in for them. Would they have to face the same doubt, the same silent judgment? As she thought about this, a woman sitting across the aisle leaned toward her. She was middle-aged, with warm eyes and a kind smile. I saw what happened earlier, the woman said in a low voice. You handled it well. Amara gave a small nod. Thank you, she said simply. The woman sighed. I travel a lot for work, and I've seen this kind of thing before. It's frustrating, isn't it? Amara met her gaze and saw understanding there. It is, she admitted. But I've learned that staying calm and proving people wrong is the best way to handle it. The woman smiled. Exactly. You didn't have to raise your voice. And yet, you made your point. She paused before adding, and now, I bet they'll think twice before questioning someone like that again. Amara hoped that was true. She didn't want anyone else to go through what she had just experienced. As the conversation ended, she turned back to her window, watching the clouds stretch endlessly into the horizon. The world was changing, but moments like these reminded her that there was still work to be done. She pulled out her laptop and began typing an email. Not a complaint, but a professional message to the airline, sharing her experience and suggesting better training for their crew. She didn't just want an apology, she wanted real change. Once she finished, she closed her laptop and smiled to herself. This wasn't just about one flight or one experience. It was about making things better for the next person. And with that thought, she finally allowed herself to enjoy the rest of her journey, knowing she had done her part to make a difference. As the flight continued, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin had changed. The tension from earlier had faded, but Amara could still feel the eyes of some passengers and crew on her. It didn't bother her anymore. She had faced moments like this before, and she knew how to rise above them. She took a deep breath, stretching her legs and enjoying the extra space. A flight attendant approached with a warm smile. This time, there was no hesitation, no doubt in her eyes. Ms. Amara, would you like anything else to make your flight more comfortable? She asked politely. Amara shook her head. I'm fine, thank you. The attendant nodded and walked away, but Amara noticed how carefully she and the others were treating her now. It was clear they had learned something today. A few minutes later, Richard Owens, the airline executive, walked back to her seat. He had a calm, professional look on his face. "I wanted to check in with you once more," he said. "I've already sent a message to our training department about what happened today." Amara raised an eyebrow. "That was fast." Richard nodded. "We take these things seriously. No passenger should ever feel out of place in a seat they paid for, no matter who they are." Amara appreciated his words, but she had one more thing to say. "I hope this isn't just about me," she said. "I want to know that the next person in my position won't have to go through this." Richard held her gaze for a moment before nodding. "I understand, and I promise you, this will be addressed." She gave him a small smile. "That's all I ask." After he left, Amara closed her eyes for a moment, letting the steady hum of the plane relax her. She thought about how easily the situation could have gone differently. If she had reacted with anger, would they have taken her concern seriously? If Richard hadn't been on the flight, would the attendants have ever realized their mistake? She knew that her calm approach had made a difference, but she also knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. Still, this was a step in the right direction. Just then, the woman from across the aisle leaned over again. "I have a feeling they won't forget you anytime soon," she said with a smile. Amara chuckled. "Good. Maybe next time they'll think before making assumptions." The woman nodded. "And maybe next time they'll treat every passenger with the same respect, right from the start." Amara hoped so. She had made her point, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been doubted in a space they had rightfully earned. As she looked out the window, watching the sun begin to set, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. This flight had started with doubt, but it was ending with a lesson learned. And that, she knew, was worth more than any first-class seat. The flight was nearing its destination, and the captain's voice came over the speakers, announcing that they would begin their descent soon. Amara glanced out the window, watching as the sky turned a beautiful shade of orange and pink. The journey was almost over, but the experience would stay with her for a long time. She took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm. The situation from earlier had been frustrating, but she had handled it with dignity. More importantly, she had made people think. The flight attendants who had doubted her were now treating her with the respect she had deserved from the beginning. The airline executive had taken action, and hopefully, this moment would lead to change. A few minutes later, the lead flight attendant, the same woman who had questioned her seat at the beginning, walked toward her. Amara could see the hesitation in her eyes, as if she were gathering the courage to speak. "Ms. Amara," she began softly, "I just wanted to personally apologize for earlier." Amara looked at her, waiting. The flight attendant continued, "It wasn't my intention to make you feel uncomfortable. I realize now that I made an unfair assumption, and for that, I'm truly sorry." Amara appreciated the apology. She could see that the woman was being sincere. "I understand," Amara said calmly, "but I hope that in the future, you and the crew will treat every passenger with the same respect, without needing to second-guess who belongs where." The flight attendant nodded. "I will," she promised. "Thank you for handling the situation with grace." Amara gave a small smile. "We all learn from moments like these." As the flight attendant walked away, Amara felt a sense of closure. This wasn't just about her. It was about making sure the next person in her position wouldn't have to go through the same experience. The plane began to descend, and the passengers started preparing for landing. Amara packed her things, double-checking that she had everything. The woman across the aisle, who had supported her earlier, leaned over once again. "You handled that beautifully," she said. "I think you made a real difference today." Amara smiled. "I hope so." As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, she felt a deep sense of pride. Not because she had proven anything to the flight crew or the other passengers, but because she had stood her ground with confidence and dignity. The seatbelt sign turned off, and passengers began gathering their belongings. As Amara stepped into the aisle, she noticed the flight attendants standing near the exit, waiting to say goodbye. This time, there were no awkward glances or quiet whispers, just polite nods and genuine smiles. "Have a wonderful day, Ms. Amara," one of them said. She nodded. "You too." As she walked through the airport, pulling her carry-on behind her, she felt lighter. This flight had started with doubt, but it had ended with a lesson. A lesson in respect, in understanding, and in the quiet power of proving people wrong, not through anger, but through strength and grace.